Right now, we are living through some very interesting and potentially challenging times. It is the end of June 2022. Right now, inflation is higher than it's been since the 1980s. The stock market's crashing. Lots of people are afraid and worried about the future as we're coming out of a pandemic. In this video, I'm going to share with you 5 books that, if you understand the mindsets, if you understand the concepts, will lead you to not only taking opportunities like this and using them to make your life better and more successful, but ultimately how to overcome any challenge that you face, whether external or internal. My name is Dr. Benjamin Hardy. Let's go ahead and jump right into the 5 books. The first book is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And why this book is so important is because it shows you how to handle a difficult situation and how to thrive mentally and emotionally in the hardest of moments. Viktor Frankl wrote about his experiences living as a Jewish concentration camp victim during World War II, during the Nazi regime. He breaks down the experiences that he saw all around him. He also breaks down his logotherapy. And what makes Viktor Frankl interesting is that he was a very different type of psychologist back then, back in the 1950s, essentially. Back then, the theories of Freud were still very, very popular, and Freud's theories were all based on a person's past. Freud believed that who you were and the developmental experiences that you had as a child were the things that ultimately impacted who you were and what you became for the rest of your life. Frankl disagreed with Freud in that degree. Frankl believed that a person's psychology, their mental well-being, their ability to be resilient in challenges was less about their past and more about the views they held towards their own future. In fact, what Frankl did to help people to actually have hope, to have healing, to be resilient, was he helped them to set goals. In fact, a few of the quotes from the book are that a person who lost hope in their future was doomed. And he also talked about how when a person lost hope and purpose towards their future, they lost their spiritual hold. They then shifted toward retrospective thoughts, whereas all they thought about was their past. The present became a prison for people who don't have a purpose to pursue. If you don't have a purpose, which according to Frankl is a specific goal that you feel is so important, if you don't have that purpose, then your present loses meaning and it becomes too difficult. You cannot bear the suffering that's going on in your life. But if you have a purpose for your life, if you have goals that you believe are so important and worthwhile to pursue, then you can have meaning in your suffering. Frankl in this book quoted Nietzsche a lot, who said, if you have a why to live for, you can bear almost any how. In this book, Frankl talks about the why that allowed him to survive. Firstly, he wanted to be reunited with his wife, Tilly, which unfortunately he was not able to do. But the second thing he really wanted to do, and he lays it out in this book, is that he wanted to survive so that he could rewrite the book that he was writing. He was writing a book called The Doctor and the Soul, which was laying out his ideas. And then when he got taken by the Nazis into the concentration camp, he actually kept the manuscript with him. He kept it hidden, and then ultimately it was taken and destroyed. And so while he was in the concentration camps, he would ultimately steal scraps of paper and jot down his ideas. And he said in the book that his deep desire to rewrite that book helped him to survive the rigors of the camp. So no matter what you're going through, no matter how bad it looks, you absolutely can survive if you have a why to live for. And this brings up a lot of the research on hope these days. Hope is very important. I love the quote from Seth Godin. He says, without hope, people wither and perish. The scriptures say without purpose, people perish. And so the idea is without hope in your future, and hope is a lot more powerful than optimism. A lot of people think that hope is basically optimism, and optimism is a general sense that the future will be better. Hope is a lot more definite of an optimism. Hope is 3 things. You have to have a clear and specific goal, which you're heavily committed to. You then have to have what's called pathways thinking, meaning you're flexible. You're willing to adjust your pathways and find new and different pathways along the way. And the third one is agency thinking, meaning you have the agency and belief that what you do matters, that you can impact your behavior. To have hope is actually a very high bar, and hope is essential for human thriving. Think about what happens when a person loses hope towards the future. Everything becomes meaningless. And that's actually what Viktor Frankl found, was that the moment a person lost hope towards their future, they literally died. He could see the light go out of their eyes. They became introspective. They stopped being outward. They stopped sharing their bread. They stopped communicating with others. They went inside. They sought short-term dopamine rewards to numb them from the pain of the present. They could not bear their suffering. They lost their spiritual hold, as Frankl would say. They became retrospective in their thinking. They only thought about the past, which they felt was taken from them. Life became meaningless for those people. And in those dire conditions where death was all around them, where they were being starved, they died. Without purpose, the physical body cannot sustain itself. With purpose, the physical body can go long beyond what seems natural. Even if you study the founding fathers of the 18th century, and by the way, back in the 18th century, the life expectancy in America was 39 years old. Yet if you study people like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, a lot of the founding fathers, they lived above the 60s, and a lot of them lived into their 80s back when the life expectancy was 39 because they had a clear purpose for their future. So this book really explains why it is essential to have a clear purpose for your future. Frankl called it a meaning to be fulfilled. He called it specific goal. He said that any attempt to alleviate the pathological impact of the camps by therapeutic means had to point out to the person a future goal to which they could strive. Frankl also said that what man needs is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task. This book is very important in times like this, because if you're in a difficult situation, and certainly none of us are in a concentration camp, although you can be in a very devastating situation. You could be in an abusive relationship. You could have just lost your house or your business, and things can look dark. But withdrawing and going inward isn't the goal. Instead, you need a meaning to be fulfilled. You need a future purpose. Frankl's research fits perfectly with the research that's going on these days on future self and on the subject called prospection. And it's the idea that as people, our psychology in the present is really based on our views of our future. If you have a hopeful, exciting, compelling future, you will have a positive present. But if your future is indefinite, if it's pessimistic, if it's negative, or if it's just so short term because you're just caught in dopamine loops of living day to day or just basically seeking short-term rewards, then you're going to have a very negative present. And actually, a lot of the research on future self shows this. There's actually a great TED Talk called The Battle Between Your Present and Your Future Self that talks about how most people struggle in the present because the present is so immediate. You know, it's easy to seek short-term rewards, whereas it's hard to invest in your future self where the rewards are far away, but that's where you start to build amazing confidence and momentum. Having a future purpose that you're continuously investing in and going for is very powerful and very exciting. The next book, I don't actually have the physical copy on me, but it's called Peaks and Valleys by Spencer Johnson. It is an unbelievable book. It's also a short book, something you could probably read or listen to in an hour and a half or 2 hours. Spencer Johnson wrote the parable book, Who Moved My Cheese? Peaks and Valleys is also a parable style book filled with insane levels of wisdom. The core concept in Peaks and Valleys is that the bad things that happen in people's lives happen because of what they do on their peaks, whereas the good things in life happen because of what they do in their valleys. Let's start with the first part because it's relevant on all levels. The bad things that happen in people's lives happen because of what they do on their peaks. When you're on a peak, meaning things are going well, meaning there's not a lot of difficulty, it's really easy to take things for granted. In fact, as people, it's hard to appreciate when things aren't going wrong. When things aren't going wrong, we just quickly adapt. As humans, we just adapt to good times. We don't appreciate them. You could make a lot of progress and just want more of the next things. Actually, that's called the hedonic treadmill. When things go wrong, we start to really freak out, but when things are going good, we take it for granted. And so when you're on a peak, and if you think about America as a nation or any superpower, Ray Dalio and even historians have talked about when you're on a peak as a nation or when you're a superpower, that could then lead to a downfall. There's a great quote that says that hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create bad times. It's a cycle. And so good times can often create weak people who get complacent, overconfident. They don't appreciate the moment. They stop investing in a bigger future self. They stop learning their lessons. And so again, back to peaks and valleys, the bad things in people's lives often happen because of what they do on their peaks. Dr. Gay Hendricks calls this the upper limit problem. Dr. Gay Hendricks wrote a book called The Big Leap, and he talks about how when people are advancing forward and they're making progress, often because they still have the identity and the self-image of their past self, because they're making progress, they don't feel worthy of that progress. They then flush it down the toilet and subconsciously self-sabotage to pull their life back to their homeostasis. There's another great book on this subject, which is not part of the Big Five in this video. It's called Raise Your HDL, which is your healthy deserve level by Gary Cady. And he talks about this idea that you don't get in life what you deserve, but what you believe you deserve. And so if you start making success and progress, but you don't believe you deserve it, or you feel guilty for the success you have, then you will subconsciously self-sabotage to bring yourself back. So it's important that you healthily evolve yourself emotionally so that you don't hit that upper limit problem. But also, as you're making progress, as you're having success, you don't get over complacent. You don't stop investing in a bigger future self. You got to continuously have a future self. And that's one of the problems with success is that as you get successful, then you start ultimately just consume. You start consuming all the dopamine rewards all around you rather than continually investing and being clear on your future self. So back to peaks and valleys, Spencer Johnson talks about how the bad things happen in your life because of what you do on your peaks, but the good things happen because of what you do in your valleys. And a valley could be internal or it could be external. It could be a challenge you face. It could be losing a job, a loved one. It could be that you're in a recession, but what you do in your valleys determines how big the peaks are in the future. When it comes to investing, a lot of people are pretty clear on this. When you're in a valley, talking about like the stock market and stuff, when things go down, that's actually when you should be investing more and more into your future self. As Warren Buffett said, buy when there's blood in the streets. You should be buying when most people are selling out of fear, and you should be selling when most people are overconfident and stuff like that. When they're on the peaks, you should be selling high and buying low. Most people do the opposite though. When they're on the peaks, they're overconfident, they're greedy, whereas when they're in the valley, they're living out of fear. And so mainstream psychology, most people's attempts at living in these peaks and valleys lead them to failure. But if you apply the principle of, being wise on the peaks and being really aggressive and committed while you're in the valley, really learn from the valley, really invest big in your future self when everyone else is scared. I love the book, The 10X Rule by Grant Cardone, and what Grant Cardone talks about. And he wrote that book in 2010, right after the recession of 2008 and 2009. He talked about how most of his friends who owned businesses were letting people go during the recession. They were really scared. They were going inward. They were shrinking. They were constricting themselves. They were saving and conserving rather than investing and going big. Whereas Grant Cardone did the opposite. He expanded. When things are tough, when you're in a valley, you expand, you don't constrict. Because if you're constricting, then you can't make massive progress towards your future self if you're not making leaps towards your future self, if you're not being aggressive, if you're not investing in your future self in whatever way that looks to you. And by the way, any investment towards your future self is just proactive action towards your goals. Investing in your future self could be reading that book. It could be exercising. It could be literally putting money into an asset. But if you're not investing in your future self, if you're not being aggressive towards your goals, and instead you're constricting and being fear-based, how could you possibly create a bigger future? In fact, in psychology, they break down motivational goals into two categories. Either there's approach-oriented goals or there's avoid-oriented goals. Every human behavior is to approach something you want or to avoid something you don't. And if you're in a situation like a recession, as an example, or financial downturn, or you're just in a difficult moment, you become overly avoid-oriented, where you're avoiding loss. And most people are fearful of loss. That's actually the number one negative emotion. The core aspect of all negative emotions is fear of loss. People avoid loss more than anything else. If you become avoid-oriented and you're constricting inward and you're scared rather than being aggressive and investing and learning and committing towards a bigger future self, then you're in trouble. And peaks and valleys ties perfectly in with Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, that when you're in a tough spot, you need a clear vision for your future. Back to Frankl, you need a purpose and a meaning to fulfill. And so if you're in that valley, you need to get clear and connected to and committed to your bigger term future self, and then invest big in that future self when everyone else is afraid and essentially going inward. That's when you expand, using Grant Cardone's words, and you start committing to your future self. What choices you make in your valleys have exponential returns. When you're on a peak and you're investing in your future self, you don't get as big of returns as you do when you're in the valley. As they say, when there's blood in the streets, that's when you invest, because that's when you get the biggest returns. During the Great Depression, that's what made the most millionaires out of any other time, because it's during these valleys that the best opportunities are available to those who are willing to invest in their future selves, whereas most people are going to be scared because they've got negative and limiting views of the future. Book number 3 is my own book, Be Your Future Self Now. This book just came out. Down below, you can actually click the link and get resources. But in this book, I break down all the science on future self. I also share the story of Frankl and go into a little bit more depth into the science of hope. But just to be super brief, you need a clear view of your future self, and you also need hope. Without hope, you get in trouble. This book just breaks down all of the recent science on future self. And one of the big ideas, the big ahas, is that whatever view you hold of your future self is the driver of who you are today. I love the book, The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, where they say that commitment is a statement of what is. You can know what you're committed to by the results you're producing, not by what you say your commitments are. What's really interesting is we're all committed to a future. Actually, in psychology, they call it a default future. They also talk about that in the book, The 3 Laws of Performance. But we all have a default future that's ultimately governing and driving our behavior. You have a default future. I have a default future. Whatever that default future is it's the future self that you most believe in and that you're most committed to. We're all committed to a future, and that future is driving our present. This also connects to the research on identity, that your identity is what you're most committed to as a person, and your identity comes from the goals you're most committed to. The sad part for most people is that the goals they're committed to are very short term, paying the bills, getting to work, watching TV, scrolling. You can know what you're committed to by actually observing your own behavior, because your commitment towards your future is the driver of your identity, but your identity is the driver of your behavior. And so you can know what you're committed to simply by watching your behavior. You might say that you're committed to writing a book or growing your business, but all you have to do is watch your behavior to know what you're ultimately committed to. You may be, eating junk food or scrolling social media or whatever you're doing. And so the behavior is the proof of the commitment. The result is the proof of the commitment. So this book, Future Self, shows you where all the research is on future self. It shows you why most people set their future selves up for failure. In fact, Dr. Daniel Gilbert, the Harvard psychologist who did a TED Talk back on 2014 called The Psychology of Your Future Self, he talks a lot about why people set their future selves up for disaster. Hal Hershfield, who's been studying this topic for several years as well, talks a lot about how the pull of the present ultimately is too powerful. People seek short-term dopamine rather than the dopamine that would fuel them towards long-term commitment. Hershfield also talks about how the way you get moving forward is you get connected to your long-term future self, and then you start massively making progress. You build a relationship with your future self, a friendship with them, so that you want to invest in that relationship. You invest in your future self, and that then leads to confidence, identity capital, and all sorts of success. So this book will show you ultimately how to get connected to your long-term future self, and then how to start being your future self now. There's a great quote actually from Florence Shin. Florence Shin said that faith knows it has already received and acts accordingly. So when you know that what you want is already yours, you'll start acting accordingly. Dr. Stephen Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, has a similar quote. He said, "To know and not do is to really not know." So if you know but don't do, then you don't know. And so the goal is to get to the point where you know that what you want is already yours. And Dr. Joe Dispenza actually talks about how to do that. He talks about proactive gratitude. And basically what proactive gratitude is you're grateful ahead of time for what you want, because gratitude as an emotional state is usually retrospective. When you're grateful for something, it assumes that it's already happened. But when you're grateful for the future, you can get to a place where emotionally you are having the experience as though it already occurred. Back to Florence Shin, faith knows it has already received and acts accordingly. So you can visualize your future self. You can then experience gratitude that what you want is already yours. You can also then be your future self and write a letter as your future self to your current self. Research from Dr. Hal Hershfield shows that it's actually easier to bring your future self to you than for you to go to your future self. So imagine your future self 3 to 5 years into the future having accomplished your current purpose. Back to Frankl, you need a purpose, a specific purpose that gives your life meaning. So imagine your future self on the other side of that purpose, having lived it, accomplished it, and created it. And then you can write a letter as your future self, speaking to your current self, and you can get wisdom from your future self. Josh Waitzkin, who wrote the book, The Art of Learning, actually did an interview with Tim Ferriss, and he talked about how the person who can give you the best advice out of anyone is your own future self, because who would know you better than your own future self? So be your future self now is book number 3. The 4th book to help you become recession proof is Tiny Habits. This is a really powerful book that shows you how to actually make progress towards your future self. As I was talking about with Be Your Future Self Now, you want to start making investments towards your future self, but the problem that most people have is that they're unwilling to start really small. Like say you want to become a tennis player. A lot of people won't start small. They won't start as an amateur, and so they'll never start at all. But really, you got to start small. And this book is all of the fundamental research. In fact, BJ Fogg's research is the basis of James Clear's insights in the book Atomic Habits. But what BJ Fogg talks about is that you really want to start small. Make it so incremental, so easy that you can start. Even a small investment in your future self. Say, for example, you want to get fitter. An investment could be literally doing 1 push-up. Rather than doing 10, you do 1, because 1 is doable. You actually can accomplish that. But by actually making it small and bite-sized enough that you can actually do it, you then start to build confidence. As you make little progress, even incremental progress towards your future self, you start building confidence, because confidence comes from seeing progress. Confidence comes from watching yourself do it. James Clear actually said that every behavior you perform is a vote for the type of person that you see yourself as. And so by doing small wins, such as just simply making your bed, if you're a writer, rather than trying to write a whole chapter, just write 100 words. Like, make it doable. By actually engaging in a small doable goal, you build confidence, but also it increases motivation, because by actually having engaged in it and seeing yourself do it and believing that you can do it, then you start to be more motivated that you can do it even more. Tiny habits is really cool because it just invites you to start making small, daily, consistent investments in your future self. And that's really how you can develop the habits of and become your future self. One thing I will say about habits is that habits, as far as I see it, are the opposite of deliberate practice. You can use habits to become your future self, but building habits or becoming your future self is always a deliberate act. Habits are essentially you on autopilot. Habits are more your current self, whereas deliberate practice, which is how you consciously develop skills and become your future self, that's how you become your future self. And there's a lot of research that shows in order to engage in deliberate practice, you need a clear goal. You need clear vision for your future self. You can't just engage on autopilot. In fact, deliberate practice is actually there to counter habits. That's what Dr. Anders Ericsson said in the book Peak. He's the lead researcher on deliberate practice. Habits actually lead to, over time, diminished performance, and it's also thoughtless. Whereas to engage in deliberate practice, you need clear, specific goals, and you need to put yourself in situations of difficulty and feedback where you're working on improving your performance. So this book, I believe, is a great way of showing you how to develop the type of habits that ultimately lead to deliberate practice. And it just shows you to start small daily investments in your future self over time create the compound effect. Final book, Essentialism. The reason I tell you about Essentialism is that when you're going through challenging times, or when you're even not, it's super important to stay focused on the essential. Almost everything is irrelevant. Almost everything out there is noise. Everything out there is a distraction. You've got to be clear on your future self, and your future self cannot be broad. Your future self has to be specific. I love the quote from Zig Ziglar. He said, "It's better to be a meaningful specific than a wandering generality." So it's key that you define for yourself what is essential. I love the quote from Jim Collins in the book Good to Great. He said, "If you have more than 3 priorities, you have none." So the key is to have a very clear, specific, meaningful future self that's essential, and then to get rid of everything else. One of my favorite quotes comes from Robert Brault. He said, "We're kept from our goal, not by obstacles, but by a clear path to a lesser goal." So it's not that we're stuck by the obstacles between us and our goals. It's that we have too many goals. It's that we have lesser goals. It's that we're into distractions. It's that we give into things that are non-essential. Life is meant to be simple. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. If you have clear priorities, clear goals, and you know what's essential to you, you can ultimately clear the clutter and have a very peaceful, simple life and not be worried about all the noise and distractions of the outside world. And so in these times, in these challenging moments, it's more important than ever to know what you believe in, to know what's essential, to know what's important, so that you can make those meaningful, important investments, so that you can be present towards what matters to you and not be caught in the thick of thin things. I know that during challenging times, you can turn those times to your gain. You can create what's called post-traumatic growth. You can take a valley and turn it into bigger peaks than ever if you're willing to expand during these times, not constrict. If you're willing to invest big in your future self during these times when most people are constricting, they're living in fear. Commitment is a statement of what is. I love that. I also love the quote that basically, until one is committed, there's a hesitancy, the chance to draw back. Once you make a decision, the universe conspires to make it happen. Once you start making commitments towards your future self, then all sorts of things transpire. From the orientation of commitment, your behavior changes. You start to find new and better pathways. Commitment, I would say, precedes hope in a lot of ways, because once you get committed, then you become much more oriented to finding pathways towards your future self. Hope is pathways thinking, or a big aspect of hope is pathways thinking. But in order to truly be the best at finding new and different pathways, you've got to have an extreme commitment, because once you are highly committed, then all sorts of doorways and pathways will open up to you. You'll be more receptive to them. You'll be willing to find the way. I know that we're in difficult times right now, but I also know that this is the time when you can actually make the biggest investments. You can turn these valleys into bigger and bigger and bigger peaks. It's what happens to people. It's why more millionaires were made during the Great Depression than any other time, because it's in these challenging environments when most people are falling apart, that if you're clear, if you're committed, if you're wise, in a few years from now, you'll be in a fundamentally different place. Your future self will thank you. Hope you enjoyed that. Please sign up for the Future Self tools down below at the link at futureself.com, and have an amazing day. See you.